Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachael Stavchansky, and I'm here to talk to you about how to make change in the world of API documentation. These slides are available at slides.com/rstav, so you can follow along or you can follow up later. I'm currently the documentation group manager at Netlify, where I contribute to developer documentation, UI copy, and of course, API docs. But meanwhile, my first love was the performing arts, a place where, as a shy young person, I could entertain and bring a smile to people's faces. And my very first show, this is a picture from it, was a fundraiser called Cats, K-A-T-Z. It was kind of like the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, but with fewer furry cat suits. So in my long journey, I went on to become a teacher, and I specialized mostly in the arts. But eventually, after taking a good look at my skills and interests and how they lined up with the local economy, I found my way into technical writing. So, what are we going to talk about today? You may have read the title of this talk and maybe you were a little bit concerned. So we're going to talk about the benefits of working in this part of the documentation universe. We'll talk about how to start to provide value to your organization with API documentation, even if you don't think of yourself as deeply technical. We'll chat about different ways of collaborating on API docs, how to create API content guidelines and how to encourage developers to follow them, and we'll explain why my talk has a bit of a silly title. So here are the secret or not so secret benefits of delving into this type of work. Because it's in demand, you can make a pretty good salary and it's generally easier to find a job. It also helps your enterprise users by ensuring consistency, accuracy, and providing enough information to be useful. And it can help you understand how your company's products work at the most basic level. This is useful if you're also doing UI text or other types of documentation. I also find it satisfying. To me, it's kind of like solving a simple arithmetic problem because APIs generally work in the same ways. So working with API docs can provide a sense of familiarity when you're moving between companies or even between vastly different industries. Which brings us to how we provide value to an organization. Technical writers, in my opinion, have to balance the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the tendency to overestimate your own skill at something, even if you haven't developed competence in it yet, and imposter syndrome, which is sort of like feeling out of your depth and you don't possibly have the capacity to tackle something. Sometimes you just have to have the courage to try. This is what I call tapping into your audacious self. As it relates to API docs, our goal is just consistency, accuracy, and providing enough information to be useful. So why am I talking about tap dancing? I'll tell you a little story. I was a participant in a summer musical theater workshop way back in my limber youth. And let me just preface this by saying that I am in no way a great tap dancer, nor was I back in the day. But I was at this workshop and they announced that the one and only Gregory Hines was going to be coming to lead a masterclass. And there was going to be auditions for a spot in this class. Now, because I wasn't a great tap dancer, I had no intention of embarrassing myself by auditioning for a spot. But there was a fellow student who had no such worries. So this audacious girl, even though she really didn't know how to tap dance any better than I did, faked her way into this master class. And, by the end of the class, if you really didn't pay super close attention, she really was tap dancing along with the best of them. So sometimes we, and by we I mean me, think that we have to be an expert at something just to get started. But really, you just have to be willing to dive in, make some mistakes, and learn from them along the way. Now back to API docs. Let's start with some context. There are a number of resources that a developer needs to be successful when they're getting up to speed with an API. There's authentication and versioning information, change logs or release notes, tutorials for common use cases, info about rate limits, conceptual information about the product, SDK or library reference information, just to name a few. But today, we're focusing on just the reference information, specifically for a few REST APIs and a GraphQL API. Now, reference docs are sort of like a dictionary for the API that helps to define all of its component parts. I do want to point out that even though I'm focusing on a couple types of APIs today, APIs are a really vast universe. Over the course of my not that long technical writing career, I've encountered and documented everything from Java APIs, JavaScript APIs, ExtendScript APIs, hardware device driver APIs, and everything in between. Now, there's a lot of information out there about various tool chains and how to learn how to use them. Docs can be sourced out of YAML, JSON, out of code comments, or XML or HTML. And while it's really important to understand what you're doing from a technical perspective when it comes to sourcing the docs, this talk is really focused more on the human process aspects. Some folks may have a misconception that when the production of the docs output is automated, you don't really have to worry about what goes into the docs themselves. And while there are some code comment tools that can give you very bare bones reference docs information based on the code itself, truly useful documentation requires some thought and some collaboration. So how will I frame the thought and collaboration processes in this talk today? I will walk you through 4 brief case studies, each one representing a different project and team, and they'll cover a few different organizations that I've had the pleasure of working with without necessarily calling out a particular company, except for the one I currently work for. So in this first case study, I'll talk about an attempt to overhaul API reference docs all at once. I'll cover how I used a spreadsheet to model the API, agree on updates, and implement bulk edits. To start, some context. This particular company had a number of microservices where documentation was a bit inconsistent and varied based on multiple contributors. The engineering org included a number of consultants who worked in a different country, which had an effect on the cohesiveness of the org overall. Now, throughout my career, I've worked with globally distributed teams, but this was a unique situation because of the secondary layer of company abstraction. And next, what the preparation for this project looked like. Now, at this point in my career, I was primarily experienced with hardware driver APIs at the time. So I met with a coworker and I did some research just to learn about REST APIs. I had to identify which microservice to work on and what depth to go into. And then I found a key contact who sat in the same office as me and was ready to serve as a subject matter expert. I also spent some time looking at the current state of the reference docs. They were sourced from YAML files and run through a tool called Spectacle to create the output. An initial version of the output was already publicly available. Here's what I'm talking about in terms of the output and the component parts. You've got your resource, the description of that resource, your endpoint, which later I may call a method, and then the description of your endpoint. So in this use case, I ended up developing a spreadsheet as a way to systemically compare all of the output strings of existing API documentation and to come up with cohesive recommendations. For every endpoint and every HTTP method, the spreadsheet included the current state for each summary and description, including a number that were just missing, one or both. And as part of this process, I also wrote descriptions for groups of endpoints, which I'll call resources. I consulted with my primary contact on areas where things really just weren't clear, And then I added a suggested state for each summary and description and group of endpoint. So I then got my primary contact and other stakeholders to review the content, and I did bulk edits to the source files to update the content based on the review outcome. And after this phase, I handed off the project to a technical writer who was embedded directly with the developers and in that part of the organization. The other writer worked to edit any new initial content, stay aligned with newly refreshed content, and she added more consistency to other parts of the reference as we went. And I stayed involved as a reviewer for the API documentation. And after the project had been handed off, I moved on to polish the lesser focused external microservices. So to me, the value in this process involved taking all of these scattered pieces and figuring out how to make them tell a single story. Ideally, the API reference docs should be like a map to help the user figure out what to use, why, and how. And I know some of you may have gasped in horror when I said spreadsheet, but in this case, it worked for this particular goal, though I really wouldn't recommend it for any kind of maintenance phase. So in this next case study, I'll discuss a situation where the writer owns authoring and maintaining the API spec and some expectations that come along with that, including keeping up with the development speed and testing while documenting. And let's just take a moment to appreciate how wonderful this cat is. So in this situation, the OpenAPI spec initially lived within the same repo as the code base, although it was later moved to a separate repo for tooling reasons. The spec wasn't sourced from code comments tied to the source code. Instead, it was part of a separate directory. Initially, we used Ruby files and a tool called Swagger blocks, but we moved over to Redoc Pro and YAML files. The spec was lovingly and laboriously maintained by the technical writer embedded with the team, which for a while was me. However, the developers were available for any kind of support or troubleshooting that we needed when it was necessary. Now, in this setup, the onus was on me, the technical writer, to keep in sync with development. And this worked for this particular team because the team was kind of on the small side with about 5 developers and had good communication skills. Here are some nitty-gritty details of the collaboration. When the OpenAPI source was in the same repo as the application code, I would work in the same feature branch as the developer, so I had to really keep up. And this changed a little bit when the OpenAPI source moved to a separate repo due to tooling considerations. In this setup, it was important to run tests of the API to verify that it was working as stated in the issue or ticket. Sometimes things were a little bit different in the implementation. So I could draft out the initial content, but then I needed to verify the API behavior. This team had a great QA presence. The QA team not only tested the API, but also tested the docs along with the feature. And since the API docs were in the same feature branch for a while, they could use a serverless deployment of the app and API docs together to compare. There's a satisfaction in owning your own realm, but it's manual and it puts the onus on the writer to keep in sync with development. And working on a parallel track at the same time as developers means that you're deeply engaged in the development work. You can provide feedback on things that might need to change, or you can advocate for the end user developer or spot inconsistencies. This process involves maintaining tight communication and testing. In the third case study, I'll talk about the process of a writer following up on commits made by a developer. I've dubbed this chasing commits, but in a general sense, we're talking about editing developer drafted content. Now, I'll talk about what this process looked like and my takeaways from it. The context for this project was that our team was developing a GraphQL API as a preview for a small group of customers. Developers created the first draft through code comments directly in the source code, and the output was available in a reference site and through graphical UI, where the documentation was integrated into the tool for running queries and mutations manually. Now, in the beta version of this preview API, the tech writer would just make edits directly into the main branch to edit the code. It was a bit of a Wild West, fast-paced environment. And when the public preview was available to a slightly larger group, the tech writer would watch for commits into a feature branch and then jump in with edits before the feature branch was merged to the main branch. Hence the term chasing the commits. So looking back, this kind of flips the responsibility from the last case study to the developer. And some might argue that maybe one might not even need a tech writer, especially for a preview. So this was a really lightweight process, but it was vaguely stressful. And I'm sure we could have come up with an alternative that didn't feel quite so time-bound. But sometimes people do what they have to do in the moment to just make it work. And for this team, I did my best to jump into a process midstream and keep it going. So in this final case study, I'll talk about my current company, Nellify, where I established API documentation guidelines for backend developers who are working on the platform's REST API. And what do I mean by guidelines? Well, when I use this term, I essentially mean establishing a style guide specifically for API documentation. First of all, some context. The published API docs at Netlify are not quite where they want them to be, but this case study is the story about how we're improving them. We currently have a fairly bare bones API reference site. And when I joined the company, I noticed this and I did some digging and found that there was a project in flight by engineers to change how the API was written and generated. So the company was moving from Go to Ruby, and we were using a tool called Go Swagger, but we moved over to a tool called Swagger Yard to generate the API docs. So I volunteered to get involved, and I suggested that maybe documentation guidelines could help create consistency in the docs. So why did I choose guidelines instead of a spreadsheet? Or why didn't I just ask to own the spec outright? I thought that guidelines could help to amplify the work of a writer so that they could effectively accomplish more. And they make it easy on developers by being opinionated. Fewer decisions that they have to worry about makes it more efficient for everybody. You can also include a docs person as a reviewer to enforce the guidelines, and you can use linting tools to automate enforcement, which is something that we're looking into. As we go further in this case study, I'm changing how I frame this from what I did to what you can do if you're pondering a similar situation. So let's look at how to create this type of guidelines. Start by identifying the building blocks that you want your devs to deal with. Create a guideline for each building block. It almost doesn't matter what you choose for some of the details of your guideline. For example, if your get method summary, you're creating a guideline for it, you could start with the word fetch or get or retrieve or return. I mean, it almost doesn't even matter which one that you use because the goal is just to achieve consistency, which will lessen the cognitive load for your readers. So let me get a bit more specific about what I mean by building blocks. So looking again at this method summary, here's a guideline that I drafted for this building block. It includes specific guidelines for this particular HTTP method and examples of what to do and what to avoid. To dig in, I note to start with return, then describe what's being returned. And I go so far as to specify the article, meaning use a or an, not the. And I note to put more details into the method description instead of the summary. This had been a bit of a pain point in our initial content. I also touch on capitalization, punctuation, and more. So here's something similar for the method description. Again, there are detailed guidelines, plus a yes, do this example, and an avoid this example. And similar to the last guideline I showed, this one states the goal of the description, which is to give detailed information, how to start the description, what articles to use, and some caveats, and finally the ending punctuation. So once you've drafted your guidelines for each element, you'll want to compare against API docs that you respect. How are they wording things? What syntax choices do they use? And what punctuation? You may want to go back and update your initial drafts or add to them. But when you're reasonably happy with what you're suggesting, it's time to get feedback from your stakeholders. In my case, this meant bringing the guidelines to the docs team to review and giving representatives from the backend team a chance to share any concerns. And once you've incorporated any feedback, you'll want to document the guidelines for internal use. Along with the guidelines, you may want to include examples the developers can refer back to as they implement the source. For my guideline reference, I included examples showing how the building blocks of the code comments correspond to various parts of the output as well. So once you've got something ready to share with your organization, it's time to socialize it. In our case, we started small. One of our backend devs did a PR to test out the guidelines to update an endpoint. She used them as she crafted the initial content, and when we went through a couple of review rounds, we went back and forth, and then she merged into the source. So once we had some confidence that the guidelines were clear enough to use in a real-world scenario, she brought them to a backend guild meeting to share and just to talk up. And also at Netlify, we have company-wide demos where anyone can share something they've been working on. So I took the opportunity to demo the guidelines there and to show off the lovely PR of my coworker. So once the guidelines are out there, it's time to encourage people to follow them. Because as we know, if you have guidelines and no one's following them, it's not going to do anybody any good. So at Netlify, I work with devs on an ongoing basis to encourage adherence. We've automated the action of including the docs team as a reviewer in API-related PRs. And as a goal, I try to get back to devs fairly quickly on these reviews so that they get their docs feedback as speedily as they do for their code review, and so that they feel like the docs are a key part of the API development process. When we first started, I was pointing out specific guidelines and making suggestions to align with them. And although it's not in the screenshot, I commonly use the GitHub suggestion tool to make it easy for devs to just accept the feedback. But I did try to reinforce why I was making the suggestion and what the guideline said. Over time, it was pretty exciting to see the developers start to help each other adhere to the guidelines during code review. Once the expectation of clear documentation was set, I was no longer the only one enforcing it. So the outcome of this ongoing project, though it's not public yet, is more information and more consistency in the way that we are presenting it. Here's a wide view of the output. And I'll pause here to explain that I jumped into this project midstream and made the argument that even though this wasn't public yet, if we made these guidelines and started to adhere to them before we made the docs public, we wouldn't have to do a giant cleanup effort right before it went live. Here's another closer view of the output. And here's another example showing the end goal of a response. One thing to note is that our guidelines apply to internal only endpoints too, and this is for a few different reasons. First of all, you never know when a product manager may later decide to make something external, even though they swear up and down that it's only for internal use. Also, the audience for this reference includes internal front-end developers at our own company, as well as external enterprise users. And finally, we wanted developers who are drafting content to be able to glance at other code comments and get a sense of what they should be doing. So if all the endpoints adhere to the same guidelines, then there aren't any kind of wonky examples sprinkled in. So looking back, this process feels more like a partnership between the developer and the documentarian. Because during a PR review, we're looking at code comments that are embedded into the source files, we're able to reference the code to see that the words match what the API is supposed to be doing. This is especially helpful when a member of the docs team is working on, when a member of the backend team is working on a feature that a member of the docs team isn't heavily involved in or familiar with, even though we're the one reviewing the PR. Although I will say the pedantic bias towards action part of me wishes that we could just take a nod from my spreadsheet days and update all the content at once. It's a little bit slow going as the developers add to and maintain different parts of the spec over time. So I'm not really the one driving or owning this process, but I'm trying to stay aligned with the organizational priorities and support the ongoing project as efficiently as I can. So let's revisit and process a little bit what we've talked about over the last half hour or so. Flexibility is always good as a technical writer. Things can look very different at different companies or even across teams at the same company. Some of the process can be dictated by your preference or the team's existing way of doing things. So here's some variables that might impact the process. How much time the writer has to devote, what the company priorities are, how willing are the engineers to collaborate with docs, and how much value does the organization place on documentation? If you're interviewing for a new job, be sure to ask how the current process is set up, who owns what, whether there's room to re-examine these processes if they seem wildly inefficient to you. And see if you can get hints about the company culture and how well the documentarians, if there are any on board, are regarded. And if you're already at a company and there's a need for API docs improvements that comes up, don't feel held back if you haven't worked on API docs before. Just give it a go. A lot of our work as documentarians takes courage to constantly learn new things in order to write about them succinctly. Thank you so much for listening to my thoughts today, and I wish you the very best on your journey.
Our first question comes from Megan, who's wondering, how much programming ability did you have under your belt before getting into API docs?
That's a great question. I would say somewhat minimal, but I think something that's been true of my career over time is because I was someone that shifted into technical writing from another area, I've always been really driven to kind of catch up. So I have been taking classes in my spare time or whenever there was an opportunity for professional development at work to start to develop those skills.
That's really cool. I think people sometimes find API docs a little intimidating because they think that they're super technical. And so I really liked that you covered both sort of the technical side, but the human side too, where you got to start somewhere. And I thought that was really encouraging for people who want to get into it. There was a lot of great conversation in the chat. And some of these questions you already gave great answers to, but I thought I might ask again just in case people are watching on video, if that's okay. So Grace was wondering if you have any suggestions on beginner languages. So let's say somebody wanted to go down the more programmy route. So Grace said that she has some experience with HTML or CSS. What do you do after that if you want to keep going?
I mean, I think for me, JavaScript is the next clear progression from there because you're able to take HTML and CSS and build on that and expand from there. I also think Python is a really great beginner language. So those would be the ones that I would recommend first.
Awesome. And Mike is wondering if you've published your guidelines in a style guide of any sort for other people to use too.
I haven't, and they're still kind of getting pressure tested internally right now. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't done that step. But Mike, I appreciate the suggestion. And once it gets solidified, I will consider doing so.
You're just so in demand, Rachel. Laura is wondering how you got yourself to be automatically listed as a reviewer in GitHub.
Yeah, this is one that I answered in chat, but just to review, we used a GitHub action and it depended on a very specific label that had to be attached to a PR. Once that label was attached to the PR, the GitHub action would add the docs team automatically as reviewers.
That is such a cool tip. Swapnil says, you mentioned tech writers owning the spec. Are you also involved in creating the spec from scratch? And do you have any tips on how to add value that way?
Yeah, so in one of the case studies, I did create it from scratch. We had it both sourced in Ruby files, and then we had for previously released versions of the API, not the current version, it was just in a JSON file. And so I would go in and edit if there was some change. So I'd say it's tricky depending on the tooling that you use. Just jumping into a JSON file and editing it or a YAML file can be tricky, but there are tools available that can help validate as you edit. So I'd recommend looking into that if that's something that you're going to be doing.
Awesome. And so we've got one more question. Was a tech writer involved in the sprint review? I don't know if this is for a particular case study.
I'm not sure what the context of that question is, but if they're talking about sprint planning, yes. I mean, depending on the organization, every organization tends to work a little bit differently, but yes, the docs would be included as part of the work that needed to be done for the API work going in that sprint. And if they're talking about more retrospective view, yes, docs again had a seat at the table to look at what went well and what didn't go well in a sprint.
Great. Well, that's all the questions that I've got in my magical spreadsheet. Oh, Laura sneaks in with one more. How do you find projects that need some API doc help? Good timing, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for open source ideas, I encourage you to check out the talk a little bit earlier that happened a little bit earlier today about getting involved with open source. For me, it's just fallen into my lap because it was part of the product documentation responsibilities of the organization I was working at. But if it's something that you're interested in, I will say, I think there's room to volunteer at any organization that you're working with to say, hey, I'm really interested in developing my competency in this area. Is there any way that I could add some value to this project, even if it's not something that's currently in flight?
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Rachel. I'm sure you saw all the love in the chat for your gifts and references. Always nice to see some fun in there, in addition to just some really great information on maybe something that people here have never tried before but might be interested in. So we really appreciate it. So thanks again. And thank you for your persistence in the face of very scary audio issues. But you sound amazing.
Thanks for hanging in there too. I appreciate the opportunity. Bye, everybody.
Have a great one, Rachel. Thanks again.